What's your name?
Jana.
What's the relationship between you and the boy?
Not an easy ride either. Life is long. This is not the end.
Goeienaand. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this sort of panel discussion around Stam. I hope we're all on. I think you're still watching the trailer, perhaps. Oh, there we go. Good evening, everybody. Goeienaand allemaal. Welcome to this panel discussion this evening with Louw Venter and Gideon Lombard. Louw is the writer and director of Stam. You've just seen the trailer there now, and Gideon is one of the actors in the film. Mapanya Sodoni is, we're trying to get him online. We're having a few problems with the internet this evening. He's a youth and councillor, so we'll reflect a little bit on the topic this evening, which is about addiction as a response to society and emotional disease. I think that's how Louw framed this. I just wanted to say that I watched Louw's film and found it extraordinary in its detail and how every part of this film captures the alienation but yet connectedness of a group of people in a city fighting in a world where things are tough every single day, and sort of that pace of, where one wakes up in the morning and you just have to face life is almost concentrated and becomes under a microscope in this film, and you go into each of the characters' lives and they intersect at some point. It's beautiful. The attention to detail is incredible. There's a cast of 7. The performances are quite something else. So I'd like to welcome into the rest of the discussion this evening. I mean, Louw Venter, if you're there, the writer and the director. Welcome, Louw. Dankie.
Hi, Marianne. Thanks so much for doing this, man. So nice to be here.
Thank you for asking me. Thank you for asking me. And Gideon, you're somewhere in the ether, and you are being let in as we speak. And I'm not sure if Mapanya is around. We're going to just continue until he does find a space with enough Wi-Fi or whatever it is he needs to teleport himself to the screen. Louw, let me begin with you. And first of all, I found the title. Do people mind if we speak English, of moet ons Afrikaans praat?
I think English is absolutely fine, Marianne.
Okay. The title of the film was very interesting to me when I first thought about it, or when I first heard that you were making it. Can you just hook us onto why that was the title in a way, because it's so beautiful.
Absolutely.
In terms of.
Absolutely. So Stam, in the Afrikaans dictionary, you'd find that the word means obviously several things. It means tribe. It also means trunk, as in a tree trunk, a boomstam. And it is also the type of word on which other words are built. In other words, origin. It means the thing from which other things stem. But primarily, the idea here is that the film asks a question about certain fundamental things, and in that sense, I have this kind of idea of people being a single tribe, and within a tribe is a very complex thing. It has many different dynamics and differing opinions and politics and sensibilities, etc., etc. But there's an underlying fundamental connectedness that this film speaks about, and then asks questions about. We have, I was in a conversation this morning with a Polish film director, festival director, and in talking to this man, I identified again this strange phenomenon that we have in South African culture, that we have people from so many places. We have Malay origin, we have Khoisan, French, and Xhosa, and Zulu, and Dutch, and English, and Portuguese, etc., etc. But despite our very clear cultural differences, we have so much in common. When we travel, which I've done quite a bit with South Africans abroad, we still share a very distinct identity. We have a very distinct common shorthand as South Africans, and this film kind of goes a little bit deeper, and it sort of tries to boil things down to the very fundamental state at which we are fundamentally of the same stuff,
Well,
made from the very same stardust.
What I liked about the film was that it's about ordinary people. Often films are, are made about people who are either, celebrities or gangsters or cops or but this was a film about real people in a real city, living real lives, which we globally see, that those of us who don't belong to the 1% are gradually all going to end up needing each other. And needing to connect with each other lest we turn on each other, and that's not going to end well. I just wanted to quickly speak to Gideon,
of course,
because we had a little conversation, as we said we were going to do when we were waiting in the waiting room. Gideon, tell us a bit about your character, and also you said to me that this was one of the most profound experiences you had working on a film. Just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting following from what you said as it's ordinary people, and I like to think of story, of dramatic story. It's usually ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, or extraordinary people in ordinary circumstances, and this is a very wonderful study of the extraordinary circumstances that can be found in daily life, how daily life goes 1 degree from where we expect it to be, and it sets in motion this whole sequence of events that, if you look at the film, it's like a domino effect. It's a consequential thing, and that's actually what makes the Stam. People that would otherwise maybe not interact on a daily basis have now come together through the slight deviation of what their day could be. But I think to come to your question is, I play Davi, or David. He's a young police officer, and he's ambitious in his own right, but he's very realistic about where he is in the hierarchy, both in the police force, but also society-wise. He has a young girlfriend played by Thamm, who's Samia, and she also knows exactly what she wants out of life, and that's namely it's children, and she wants to make a home for them. And there's the thing that pulls against that in Davi is that he has a very violent family history, which he suppresses, and he hasn't let that out to Samia. He hasn't dealt with it in his own right, much less shared it with anyone else. And I think there's something very interesting in that in all the characters there's a question that comes to the surface in every single one of them that hasn't been answered by themselves, and that is what propels this thing. So there's also this Davi's journey also has a sense of inevitability, of fate, that if you don't deal with your own stuff, you're going to be doomed to repeat the cycle that created it, And I think from that, to go to the actual making of the film, I think it was so extraordinary because I felt entirely free and safe, which if you think about regular life, especially in South Africa, how often do we feel completely free and completely safe? So to tell a very specific, very challenging South African story in a fictional way, but to feel safe enough to open yourself up to what that requires, as a team of people. And then it comes to, there's the Stam on screen, but then the Stam off screen. It was one organism. It was one organism. And usually on film sets, you need several moments of perfect storms. You need a continuous storm every time to make it happen. And
Well, I thought maybe we should have a look at a clip from the film, because you mentioned the intensity of performances and what's required of the actors. And this is sort of a scene sort of towards the opening of the film with Inge Beekman and her son. So if we could just have a look at that, that clip.
Nee, Jonah. Het is nog donker. Ek weet, baby.
Wanneer gaan we terug naar Oma Magda's huis toe?
Ons gaan nie. Ouma Magda wil hê die polisie met my vang.
Is nie.
Toe maar. Kyk wat ek vir jou gekry het. Wil jy sien?
Okay. Het hy hulle weer gehaal?
Hey baby.
Ons sien geliedjie se pa.
Nee. Hy het hulle nie gehaal nie, want hy wou hulle beskerm. Onthou jy nie? In die boks.
Ek hou nie van die boks nie.
Ons gaan môre op plakkie kry om te bly. Okay, ek beloof. Okay, maar nou moet jy in die boks bly. Dis mos so avonture begin.
Ek wil my kamer hê.
Jonah.
Yeah, I mean, there we go. I mean, that sets the tone of the film. Louw, this discussion, when we planned them or when you were busy planning them, you really wanted to have a discussion about addiction as a response to society and addiction as an emotional disease. What? I'm so sorry that Mapanya is not here, because he would have added a conversation, an important layering. But speak to me a bit about what that means to you.
Well, I had a long think about how much I should disclose about myself tonight, and I think the conversation really only has value if I do. So the reality is that I am someone who struggles, suffers from addiction problems, and my journey out of that informed a lot of what underlies the story and what this character is about. It definitely is the subject that I propose for this conversation is the relationship between addiction and connection, and that is exactly what the character you just saw, Chantal, what her story is about. It is about a woman who is a mother and is clearly deeply, a loving person. She loves that child, and any mother will, hopefully, most mothers will tell you, most parents will tell you that a love for a child is unconditional. But any addict, like myself, will also tell you that the compulsion for the substance of choice is also non-negotiable. It is also unconditional. And so this character becomes a battlefield for these two ideas. In the scene we just saw, she talks about her mother, who she tells her child wants to put her in prison, ostensibly because she's taken this kid and run off. But her story is exactly about that. She needs to isolate. She needs to remove herself from society and from the norms and from the guardrails in order to live out this compulsion that is non-negotiable, that is unconditional. And at the same time, she's trying to maintain this other non-negotiable, this other unconditional love, which is for her child. And of course, they can't coexist in the same place. Then the child asks her to pick up the story, which probably they were talking about before he went to sleep, which is a story about Hansel and Gretel, which I think is a really interesting metaphor, because it is a story in which a parent has to abandon their child in order to save them. And that is central to what's going on with this character. And of course, the theme of addiction, the theme of compulsion, and the theme of this sort of unbending self-will, this need for gratifying a desire or a feeling or an urge, plays out throughout the story, and it plays out throughout society as well. What I've found in my own personal journey is how this urge to fulfill a very ultimately a selfish desire or compulsion by default removes us from society, and then more importantly removes us from principled behavior. You know, my principles were always compromised by what I needed to satisfy in myself. And
what was the root of the compulsion? Because that also interests me so much in terms of, I think, Gideon's character as well, although his compulsion, or he's trapped in something else. He's a white man in South Africa. He's a cop. He comes from a violent family. You spoke earlier on about the currents in this country has very bloody currents. I think in our DNA, in our land, what has been done to people and among people,
absolutely,
you know, stays here for a long time. And so that character for me carries those sins and that burden and that rage, and is trying to find his way out of it by being a good cop. But I don't want to give away too much in the film.
No. So Marianne, I think that the short answer to that question for me, and I've sat in hundreds and hundreds of meetings with many people like myself to discuss these things, and a very common theme that you will hear many, many, many hundreds of times is essentially a sense of belonging, or a lack of a sense of belonging. That is what it's about. In other words, a lack of connection. And this thing is a little bit like a snake eating itself, because through a lack of a sense of belonging, you know, you end up falling into a cycle with you know, addiction, and that cycle of addiction, instead of obviously solving problems, which it simply can't, exacerbates that problem. And so that very, very simply explains how addiction tends to pick up speed and is such a hard thing to escape from. The solution, of course, is a social, emotional, societal solution. It is not a chemical, physical one.
Okay. Gideon, have you got anything to say? I don't know if you have anything in your own life experience of needing. What's interesting about the sense of belonging often is that is sometimes also destructive. You know, when you are forced to belong to a society, which is what that character probably has done, when you are forced to connect in a very rigid and specific way, that too can lead to a sense of I think, alienation and claustrophobia and a lack of connectivity. So, you know, in both those realms, where in the longing for connection and in the connection, there are very toxic and damaging elements. But Gideon, do you have any thoughts on the character and what Louw's just said there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can also say that I'm also a recovering addict. I also suffer from addiction, and the sense of something that I always, it's a quote that has stuck with me for years, and it is that addiction is the only disease that tries to convince you you're not sick, right? And that's what keeps it propelling. So it's this constant negotiation and gamble with yourself, where the moment things get a little more stable, we get comfortable and complacent, and then we slip back into there's something that goes hand in hand with the compulsion is the obsession of something, right? So as soon as something's on even keel, we afford ourselves the space to become obsessed with something, and then the compulsion kicks in to actually use on that obsession, whatever that might be. But I find it incredibly interesting what you said in terms of the need for connection, and what that sometimes requires can also be damaging in and of itself. Both my parents are academics, so we moved around a lot as a family, and big moves. I spent a lot of my primary and high school either somewhere in the States or in Europe, but always back to Namibia. I was born in Namibia, but we moved roughly, like I moved when I was 3, and then back when I was 4, and then when I was 12, and then when I was 13, then when I was 17. And so at very seminal and quite formative chapters, And what happened to me is that to fit in, I thought I always had to be extraordinary. I had to be the best at something. And when you're a kid, the story you tell yourself about yourself, you augment it, or you bend it out of shape without you realizing what you're actually doing. And over time, it becomes quite a deviation from who you actually might be deep down inside. So then you come to a stage where you try to settle down in a space, and things stand still a bit, and all of a sudden you're confronted with this stranger. And that in itself, if we're talking about connection or non-connection or addiction, whatever is on the other end of that spectrum, that's a very interesting thing itself. So addiction and sometimes a fraught yearning to belong somewhere is the damage in and of itself.
I also think, sorry, Louw.
No, I was just going to say that it's very interesting for me because I feel like I write a lot of things, but I always kind of write the same thing ultimately, and so a lot of these stories in this film, for instance, are actually really quite similar in the fundamental sense, in that there's a sense of the way that exceptionalism unbalances the human being. And I'm not saying that people can't be exceptional, but when that sense, that idea of exceptionalism is sort of tied to your ego, that just disturbs a lot of these characters. And it's true for myself as well. In other words, exceptional in any particular way, whether you are the worst person in the room or the best person in the room, a lot of the time that is the conundrum. There's never a sense of being one of the people in the room, and it's in that lack of or the absence of equilibrium that this dis-ease develops, that requires distraction, that requires sedation, that requires distraction.
I think what both of you have said to me I find really interesting in terms of the personal need to find distraction. I mean, if I'm not an addict, but I did smoke dagga as a child, and for me it was about I suppose mitigating the impact of a world that I found unfathomable. I was watching cops throw people into vans. I was seeing violence. I was hearing people say really stupid things. I found myself in a world in which I felt alien. And so for me, as a younger person, the only way to mitigate that was to smoke, and take away the edges of a really harsh, horrible space. So, but both of you are white men, and I find it interesting theme coming from both of you here, which is, it might not be specific to being white in South Africa or a white African, in terms of parents saying you've got to be exceptional, you've got to be something, you've got to make something of your life, which, you know, in a very specific way, you've got to be this way. This is your language, this is your culture, this is what we expect of you. And living in South Africa without, at this time or that time, those times, and still now, without having an exploded view of the world and possibilities and other ways of thinking. I mean, why aren't people studying Chinese philosophy? You know, so suddenly your entire world focus becomes narrowed and rutted. I mean, if you live in the Cape Flats and you wake up every day, and the characters in your film, in a sense, are also from there, you know, getting by in a world that comes at you like a ton of bricks every day, where you hustle for food and jobs. You know, you think actually we need medication. I mean, you know,
it's undoubtedly there are cultural specificities. I mean, I don't doubt that for a second, but I do think there are also certain larger, you know, societal trends that are exceptionally hard on the individual human being, and that goes right across the board almost. What I mean by that is, for instance, the fact that we live in a world where we are constantly confronted with curated, edited versions of other people's reality. Like, it is absolutely inescapable. We're virtually cyborgs. You know, our phones are attached to our hands. When you wake up, you reach for your phone, and so much of what we see, whether it's
another addiction, it's another addiction. I mean,
absolutely. I mean, they've proven that your brain responds, your reward centers in your mind get a lot of the same kicks out of you do for likes and so on. But what I'm saying is, not just in the news and in the media, but also very specifically in social media, on Facebook, Instagram, all of these things, we are constantly confronted with other people's best version of themselves, and without, you know, really considering the logical implications, we tend to compare our own inner experience with other people's outer presentation. And that puts an extraordinary pressure on people to be exceptional, to have the right body, to drive the right car, to have the right amount of followers and the right amount of likes and the right amount of money, and to listen to the right music and wear the right brands, etc., etc. And that is certainly not exclusive to being a white male, middle-aged guy like myself. But I do relate extraordinarily to what you say, Marianne, because I grew up in the West Rand in Krugersdorp in the 1970s and the 1980s and the late 90s. The early 90s. And a lot of what you talk about is a lot of what David's character experienced, which is a form of brutality that is very unique and specific to sort of blue-collar, white-collar Afrikaans society, a form of masculinity that's tied up with religion, that's tied up with national identity, or that's tied up with cultural identity, and that is essentially, in my opinion, very sort of a lager forming kind of mentality, like we need to protect ourselves, and only the biggest and the best males are going to be able to protect us with their big muscles and their long guns, you know. And I experienced that, and I felt as a child extraordinarily alien to that society. The sort of racism that was so rampant in my community, the brutality, the pressure of being a man, the pressure of being able to put your fists up and fight for yourself, the pressure of having to enjoy rugby and be good at catching balls and shoot little animals, and, you know, be prepared to fight to protect your people. It was hard and it was cruel, and I could not identify with it, and my sense of other was extreme. And in my early childhood, I tried extremely hard to assimilate and to be part of that. And then when I was a teenager, I discovered drugs, and that gave me an exceptionalism and an exceptional quality, and it also gave me a way back to magic and things being okay, you know, and wonderful and unpredictable, rather than just predictably morbid.
Yeah.
Gideon,
Yeah.
was your feeling the same? I mean, you say you grew up in Namibia, but it's also, you would have probably been in a whitish community, quite isolated.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what makes Namibia an interesting study with this is at the time, it had 1.5 million people, less than that. So all the white people knew all the white people, right? So it's this tribe in and of itself. So there's this unity, but also everyone is in everyone's business, so it becomes very claustrophobic. And if the overwhelming experience of that is much like Louw described, there's racism, there's this violence, there's chauvinism, there's, and I just didn't resonate with that. And I too tried to assimilate stuff. I said the most ridiculous stuff. It's like, as a kid, you go, okay, I'm going to try racism to see if this works here. I mean, what is that, And then later, I think in a very similar way, I discovered drugs as well. And I remember the thing, if we look at this theme of connection, I knew from the instant that it was private, that it was mine. I didn't have to share any of it with this world that I felt so intimidated by, and I didn't understand it. It didn't understand me. This relationship was private. It was on our terms, and later it's on the substance's terms. You think it's on yours, but it's not. But I also knew it was private, but it was secret. And there's a huge difference between the two. I knew from the very beginning. I remember I was a small kid, and late at night when you could go to the fridge and you take a glass of water and you go back to bed, I sneakily poured wine and juice,
Wow.
So if someone saw me drinking the juice, they would go, oh, okay, it's juice.
How old were you?
Yeah, I mean, like pre-teen,
Wow.
Yeah. So, and for the longest time, you normalize it. I can still, in my head, I can normalize the most ridiculous stuff, because that is the power of that yearning towards secrecy, towards exclusion, And
Well, I mean,
I remember,
sorry.
No,
the fellowship we belong to, for instance, Gideon, I just wanted to say that there's a wonderful term in the literature, which is, I made lies, and I used, how does it go? I used excuses that were plausible but untrue. Which we saw in the clip, for instance, with Chantal saying that her mother wants to put her in prison. It's theoretically true, but it may very well not be. But in order for her to create that moment in which she can have both her child and her substance, she needs an excuse that is at least plausible, if not true.
But she's prepared to put herself through tremendous trauma, actually, in order to accomplish what kind of a freedom? I mean, none of those characters in the end. I mean, apart from, I think it's, is it Nisa J who plays the guy who's on the phone?
He plays Apiwe, yes.
Yeah, I mean, Apiwe seems to get off quite easily, except he's addicted to, to his phone, I think, and to internet dating, and never ever connecting on, as you say earlier on. This is, about connecting and what's the role social media plays in people's lives. But he has a beautiful connection when he finds Jonah in the streets. He's just, by accident. And what I loved about that moment is you're watching the film and you're saying, go, help him. And then you're also realizing what Apiwe is thinking, like, I'm a black man going to pick up a child. What are people going to say to me? How am I going to be? How is society going to respond to me? And so he begins, in fact, this attempt at getting society to do what is responsible, to do what we expect it to do. The cops and the hospitals, people who are in distress go to those institutions to look for help, but it's not there. It hasn't been there for a long time. We haven't lived in a world of loving concern and care institutionally for a long time. I think on the ground.
Institutionally.
Yeah, I think
the sad thing, of course, is that there are still individuals in those institutions. We had a panel discussion last night with various caregivers. We had Lucinda Evans on. We
Yes,
had a
fabulous.
midwife. We had a doula, and a very interesting theme that came out of that is the trauma that these caregivers experience, because they are as much subject to those systems as the victims, in many cases, well-meaning people that have no capacity, which is what that Apiwe's character ultimately also is, you know. And it was also interesting, the genesis of this entire project is imagining what do people like myself, for instance, what power do we have to be involved in things if they're thrust upon us? You know, I'm not a frontline worker. I don't have the capacity. I honestly just don't have the guts to take the world on like someone like you does, Marianne. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. But
well, I mean, what I loved also about the situation where you actually take the camera then into a nursing home, where one of the characters is then dealing with an old woman who's got dementia and who's dying, and that beautiful lying in order to make a connectedness, and the honesty of that relationship in a way as well, you know. So if people haven't watched the film, you know, I think for them to understand that it flows through the city, it flows in this beautiful way where you don't quite know how the characters are going to link up, and they do, and almost do. They just touch past each other as we do in life, actually, you know.
Yeah, in this bizarre society that we live in, I was this conversation this morning. I was trying to explain to this European person how strange it is to be a South African and traveling to Europe and seeing how ubiquitous the middle class in Europe is relative to what we have in South Africa. You know, there's a much greater sense of, you know, people being okay and having means in a place like France, for instance, than here. Here we have the 1%, as you mentioned earlier, and the 90% on the other scale, and the 9% somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean? And on top of that, we have this enormous cultural diversity, which is both obviously, you know, incredibly rich and wonderful, but also very, very complicated and difficult at times, because we've never really learned to live together, even though we do live together. And I think that's a lot of what the questions that I'm interested in is the dissonance. And so this dissonance between we don't live together and yet we do. And well, look, it's the same with this idea of addiction, that we are separate but we're not. You know, we are isolated but we're not. We want to be great, but
there's a tremendous amount of, I think, bonding in violence and in trauma and in continued trauma. So I think we are a country that suffers from post-traumatic stress. I think the Black majority suffers from post-traumatic stress in a sense of having been, you know, your sense of self being whittled away. I think white South Africans are complicit in terms of, you know, where you look back and say, oh my God, what did my ancestors do? Where have I come from? There are high levels of anxiety and trauma, and that actually is quite common and brings an intimacy, but we express it differently. If we could turn that pain that we collectively have, some more than others, into something less polarizing. And what drugs do, interesting enough, and that's what your film does, is drugs draws you all into this, like Corona. It will take you, whoever you are, doesn't care. Those drugs will take you to places that you've never dreamed you would see, you know.
Yeah, but I do think the solutions are far more interesting than the problems. Now, I know that I don't offer any answers to anything whatsoever with my film, and that was never the idea. I don't like films, I don't like art that try and tell people what to do. But I do feel that part of what we do as artists is start conversations. We start questions. So it's part of the reason I want to have this conversation, and I have this conversation a lot in another context, and it is about people also sharing ultimately, after you've asked the question, what did you do? How did you deal with it? What was your journey? And how is your journey similar to mine? How is your journey different to mine? You know, because when we start engaging around these things, the similarities suddenly become glaring. The fraternity with people suddenly becomes like astounding. I was caught personally in a world of trouble for more than 25 years. I was in trouble. And because of a sense of, and I do believe this was a sense that came out of feeling so threatened as a child, a sense of having to be superior somehow or better than people, that I could not surrender myself. I could not ask for help because I thought that asking for help would somehow make me less than. It would make me like them, the other people, the people with real problems. And when I did surrender, the most astounding thing happened in that I discovered that I wasn't alone and that I had so much more in common with people than what I had, different to them. And it sounds counterintuitive, but there's an enormous freedom in that. There's enormous uniqueness in that. In saying I am the same as this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. I'm not essentially better than people. You know what I mean? I am the same. We are dealing with difficult things, and there's such freedom in it because it allows me to accept criticism, for instance, which makes me better. It allows me to admit mistakes, which makes me able to behave better. It allows me to make amends where I've done things wrong, which gives me the freedom of living with less guilt, and less self-pity, because self-pity is, often becomes an excuse. It becomes a tool that you wield in order to behave badly,
Yeah. Gideon, your encounter within deciding this is not what you're doing. I mean, I don't want to talk. I'm in two minds about talking about the film and talking about addiction, but I think these conversations are important because they're about
the film is the beginning for me.
But I do want to return to your earlier question after speaking to Gideon about the solutions. Then I think, So Gideon, your sense of how you were able to let go of addiction, if you can ever let go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an ongoing process, and I think therein lies the lesson for. If we want to link it to the questions and the solutions, it needs to be a systemic thing, that it needs to be an ecosystem that you create for yourself, where you have healthy tools at your disposal, right? Whatever that is for you, if it's exercise, if it's all of that, those are the very practical things. But at the heart of it, it is a relationship with yourself. You have to open yourself up to get to know what is initially probably quite someone you're not going to like very much after, obsessing and compulsing and using drugs, and also to accept that as a part of you. But I think, to link this to the film, the question then becomes, if we look at David's character, is okay. The question becomes, how do we change? How do we break this cycle, this template that has been handed to us culturally, and this weight on our shoulders to go, you have to propel this class and this language and this. I read a wonderful quote recently by Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things, and it's in one of her political papers. And she said, history has not become past, but it has become the study of the future. And what she means by that is we're more than ever using our own personal history to determine and justify where we're going. Right. So if I end up here, and I manipulate it artfully enough, I can go, yes, well, it's because of my trajectory up until now. There's almost an inevitability here. And I think part of the surrendering that brings perspective as well, where you go, oh, I have a choice here and there. A lot of stuff is not in our control, but the things that are in our control are solely to do with how we react to things. So I'm talking about, I'm talking. It's a bit of a whirlwind of a conversation, but I think if you,
as usual, Gideon, as usual.
What role does shame play in addiction? Personal shame, is there, because I think it probably plays quite a strong role in addiction.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Marianne.
No, it's fundamental. It is absolutely fundamental. It's often described as the following: that guilt is something you experience because of the actions that you take, and shame is a feeling that you experience because of what you perceive to be yourself to be. And that is an extremely difficult thing to escape from, because as long as you are shameful about who you are, it's that same thing, actually. It's extremely ironic, but when you are in a state of self-pity or a state of shame, it really doesn't make that much difference whether you change your behavior or not. I just wanted to add to something that Gideon said, which is true for me personally, and it is absolutely 100% true that my journey towards emotional health and spiritual health is entirely tied up in self-knowledge. But the bizarre thing is, I could only learn things about myself and get a better understanding of myself through interaction with other people. I could not achieve self-knowledge in isolation. That is pretty much the core of this entire thing that we are discussing, is that I cannot get to know me without other people. Because it is sitting with other people. It is about conversing. It is about actually listening. And therein lies a lot of what makes connection is curiosity about other people. Curiosity, in my opinion, is an extraordinarily powerful human quality. It kind of changes so much. It's incuriosity, like Trump-like incuriosity, that brings the world to its knees. And people as well. And curiosity about other people is something that I think is a thing that you can develop, and I have developed. It's this people call it active listening, for instance, and that listening, ironically, teaches you so much about yourself, because there's this idea that for me at least, that if you listening to yourself, it's like being in an echo chamber. The same ideas are just constantly reflected back. So if you've been talking crap to yourself all the time, it's just going to keep echoing backwards and forwards. But sitting in rooms with other people or outdoors or whatever, and listening to people honestly speaking about themselves, things are revealed to you that are not as apparent as you think they would be. And I guess what's required there is vulnerability, and that is also something that I've learned.
And I mean, I agree with everything completely, and I resonate so much with it. And I think if you take shame and you see how shame comes into that and actually prohibits it, for me at least, it's shame makes me retreat to the privacy or the secrecy I described earlier. I feel too ashamed to share it, right? So I retreat, but then I end up in my echo chamber. So I keep telling myself, you're not worthy, you're not good, you messed up. And that's the only thing I hear. It's not possible for me to experience any other listening or engaging. So, and it reinforces the shame. So it becomes this very horrible loop where you go, okay, I'm feeling shameful about the thing that I did because I felt shameful. And because I feel shameful, I'm going to do that again because there's a bit of relief in it, but it's going to mess me up again, and I'm going to feel, you
just slide into it and stay there, and it's.
But it's also dangerous. Yeah, that's what makes Gideon's character in Stam so extremely dangerous and ultimately explosive. Is that is untenable? It just causes an enormous pressure. I mean, and that's the kind of stuff that I guess most of us experience and see in our lives. In violent situations. I mean, that's stuff that I grew up with that just absolutely horrified me. Like I had no, I don't think I should tell the story, but
I think what you both said is quite correct in terms of how you need to be curious to, you'll only hear, the world is as you are to a certain extent, unless you're a poor person who's been marginalized and, had your land removed, and you are, you have no sense of agency because the system gives it not to you. But I'm talking about if you, in a sense, how you approach the world is how the world approaches you. And so the curiosity, what that does is it opens up spaces in order for you to be able to enter. I mean, I've just saying, my mother was Portuguese, my father was German. I enjoyed both of them. They've opened up worlds for me, living in South Africa, speaking Afrikaans, learning isiXhosa history, dealing with Afrikaans. So for me, all of these things nourish me. All of these things on the outside, I mean, there is so much in there. You know what I mean? You need to feed the inside. I think I'd like to just prep to see the next clip of the film, because the consequences of what happens here, in a sense, push the film slightly forward. But I just wanted people to be able to look at the, at everything about this film. So
cool.
We're just giving our producer a chance to load it up. Wow. Yeah, just that moment.
This breaks my heart.
Yeah, absolutely.
Marianne, I just wanted to very quickly tell you that location we shot there, that's at the end of Chapel Street in Woodstock.
I know it.
You know that circle. So when I recce'd that location about 2 weeks before we started shooting, there was that exact village that you see there, sort of briefly in the shot, was there. Like sort of lean-to structures with homeless people there, and pretty much literally all of them addicted to some substance or the other. And by the time we got back there 2 weeks ago, there was nothing and no trace of these people. I spent years talking to people under bridges and trying to understand their stories. And that is how it works in this city. If you find yourself in a really vulnerable position like that character does, that is your reality. There is no one to protect you, whether it is a private security company, a neighborhood watch, or the police. You can have your little structure ripped out from under you. Just like that. And I'm sure you know that.
Well, I think this is something that we need to actually also raise in relation to the film in terms of homelessness globally, and how people who are homeless have become criminalized. I think we have a member of the city here who actually speaks about homeless activists as agitators. There's 600,000 people on a waiting list. How people have every right to protest a need for shelter at some point. So that terrible cycle of finding yourself on the street, the only way that that is bearable is to interact with the economy of the street, which is drugs, sex, exploitation, human trafficking, and then the cops come and arrest you.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
and that's
exactly
how you
right.
drugs,
And we as a society are not playing our part. If we can mobilize the way we did in this country around something like Corona, for instance, because there's no shame attached to it, it is absolutely unforgivable that we treat people who suffer from addiction as if it is their fault, as if they are somehow bad people for suffering from some sort of a mental illness, a disease, which is what it is. It is absolutely shocking. So, you know, despite the fact that I constantly talk about like people who suffer from addiction need to do their part to become connected. We, the rest of us, well, society at large also needs to play their part in connecting with people that suffer from this disease, which is ubiquitous, as you know, and has enormous knock-on effects in society. And I'm not talking about just street drugs. I'm talking about black label beer as much as I am talking about Turk. This disease eats away at families, it eats away at society, and we stand by and somehow leave it to the individual, you know, and that is not okay.
Where has it worked in the world? What is you know, we you know, I think the silent scream or chasing the scream, you know, it's Johann Hari's book about the war on drugs hasn't worked. It's in a sense just created an entire illicit economy. We have this in the Western Cape as well. It literally, you know, on the one hand, there's this economy of banks and shops and clothes and labels, and on the other hand, it's just sex, drugs. You know, that's the ordinary person's economy. Has Portugal had some success, Gideon? I don't know if you know anywhere else in the world where Holland, the treatment of addicts is done in a much more humane way and in a way that is far more healing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, whatever that solution or wherever that is, I don't have a very good example just offhand. I've also heard about Portugal. I think Holland has, you know, whatever that is, I think it has to do with what we were talking about earlier, is there is some kind of unshaming or bringing it out into the public and going, okay, here is this thing. It might be very dangerous, but let's acknowledge that first, whatever it might be, whether it's tick or beer or whatever. And yeah, I think I don't know where it has worked, but the experience that I have felt does work is to bring it out into the open, and to acknowledge its presence and its capability on a society as a whole, not just on the individual. We, you know, if you look at film history or whatever, there is the individual struggle with drugs because that's how we identify. But I don't think we've thought enough about identifying with society. Where do I feel at home? And what happens when that is threatened? You know?
I don't think you can solve a problem by disengaging, right?
Yeah,
Completely.
Which is generally what we do. That's why we throw people in prisons, because we don't. It is easier to take someone and put them in an institution than to change the circumstances that put them there in the first place. You know, I did do the final mix and the visual effects and the grade of this film in Holland, because it is a co-production with a Dutch, an official co-production. So I did spend a month in Amsterdam recently. They have problems. Don't get me wrong, but you know, criminalizing behavior that you know you haven't dealt with just creates crimes. That is my honest opinion. You know, I don't believe that helps. I don't, you know, like the very idea of punishment is doesn't really make a lot of sense somehow.
I think we've reached 8:30. It's gone very, very quickly, and I think what we need to hold in mind is actually in South Africa we've got many tools that we need to leverage as citizens and as people in order to help each other in terms of housing, drug addiction, medical help. Interestingly enough, we're beginning to discover that we can use those tools that exist there for us. We've just been stuffed over by a series of governments and people who in the end have not shown really that we matter or people matter. So thank you for a beautiful film, and for beautiful performances and for your care and for using this as a platform so people can understand they need not be shamed. If you're stealing money from the state or you're a Gupta, then you must feel shamed. But in order to heal a pain or look for connectedness, there are ways out of it. And actually life can be, with very little, a beautiful connected thing with another human being. So Louw, thank you, Gideon, dankie. And for alle mense
Thanks,
wat
Marianne.
gekyk het, thank you. And everybody who's been here tonight and made this work, thank you very much and good luck with your film.
Thanks very much.
Go and slay them overseas.
Thank you, darling. And thanks to Igu from the KKNK and John and yourself.
Yeah.
You're amazing. And if I can just say one last thing, which is if I can encourage anybody out there to do something, it's simply this. Go look into a stranger's eyes and see what you recognize in there.
Yeah. Well, we're all from the same cosmos. Gold was from outer space and so are we. So I'm you and you are me. And let's try and get better. Thank you, my friends, and thank you for what you do. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Marianne.
Ik het oor baba gedroomd.
Bly in die boks. Okay.
I just want to talk to you, please.
Hey, this is my boy. Got a little red jacket on.
What's your name?
Jenna.
What's the relationship between you and the boy?
Not an easy ride, is it? No, sister. Life is long. This is not the end.